Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Global and Community Health Seminar, which is being offered to you today as a collaboration between the Office of Global and Community Health and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I'm Jane Barrow from Global and Community Health, and it is my pleasure to introduce you today to Dr. Brian Swan, our Interim Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, who will be introducing today's speaker. Dr. Swan.
Thank you, Dr. Barrow, and appreciate that introduction and the work that your office is doing. And just very happy and proud to be on this call with our guest today, Mayor Steve Benjamin. And it is a pleasure to introduce you, Mr. Mayor Benjamin, to the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. And just a little of a couple of tidbits on your biosketch. Dr. Mayor Benjamin.
I'll take doctor. I'll take
doctor.
Yeah,
it might be that too, right? Okay. At least an honorary for the work that you have done.
Juris Doctus, right?
Yeah. Right. And we're looking at 2000 and let's see.
I think we lost Dr. Swan.
Uh-oh. Okay. Well, Mayor Benjamin, you were mayor of Columbia, South Carolina for a record 12 years. And during that time, you instituted a number of changes in the city. And also went through a major hurricane, Hurricane Joaquin, which resulted really in a disaster for the city.
Sorry for that interruption. But 2018 to 2019, Mayor Benjamin served as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and he was also the chairman of the Municipal Bonds of America. He was member of the Federal Communications Commission's Intergovernmental Advisory Committee, and also served as co-chairs of the Mayors for 100% Clean Energy campaign. He was recognized by President Barack Obama for his work on behalf of My Brother's Keeper organization, and he also had the honor of speaking at the 2019 Democratic National Convention. Dr. and Mayor Benjamin is married to Honorable Andrea Gist Benjamin. She is the Chief Administrative Judge for South Carolina's 5th Judicial Circuit, and they are both the proud parents of 2 lovely daughters. And due to the COVID pandemic, one other thing I'd like to mention, that in March of 2020, Mayor Benjamin and the Columbia City Council passed the Resilient Columbia Economic Sustainability Plan, were loans, givable loans to small businesses. So without further ado, we are honored to welcome you, Dr. and Mayor Steve Benjamin, to the Harvard School of Dental Medicine.
Dr. Swan's gonna make me a doctor before it's all over. I want to accept it, man. No, thank you. Always love saying no. Thank you for reading my bio just like I wrote it. I appreciate that. We had a chance, obviously, to briefly chat before we started today, and it's always interesting when people ask me what led me to my career path. What led me to where I am right now. And I often tell people it's a whole lot of grace and mercy, some amazing mentors, and awesome family. If God had let me pick my own 2 parents, I couldn't have done a better job than Sam and Maggie Benjamin. Put me on track, a kid growing up in South Jamaica, Queens, whose roots are in rural South Carolina, the deep South, but like generations of African Americans had to leave their home, leave the South, leave their families in search of economic opportunity. I was fortunate enough that my path sent me back to South Carolina, to matriculate at the University of South Carolina, where I was introduced to some amazing mentors. who kind of put me on track to do some things in life that I never would have imagined doing. When I arrived in Colombia on August 17th, 1987, I literally gotten out of high school by the skin of my teeth. I was a very smart young man who had not yet fully realized his potential in life. I've been suspended from high school twice. The SAT saved me and allowed me to get accepted to the university. But the country, the world, this community, my microcosm at the university was steeped into a history of civil rights activism that particularly was focused at that time on apartheid in South Africa, and also on taking the Confederate battle flag off the State House dome. That got me involved as a young activist that literally from that point forward, as a 17-year-old who learned to not only advocate and agitate, but also learn that activism without action is just a conversation, that you had to actually try and get some things done. It began to inform my idea of pragmatic leadership. When people ask me about politics, while I am a Democrat, I run nonpartisan as mayor of Columbia for 3 terms. My brand of politics has always been radically pragmatic. You got to get something done. You got to get it done from a point of view that usually, if you put 2 people in a room who come from very different backgrounds, but are equally yoked, good people who actually are about elevating the human condition. But one's are different races, different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds, maybe even different faiths, that if in fact you ask them to put the 10 most important things to them and their family on the legal pad, write them out. The reality is that although the world tells them that they're so very different, the reality is that 7 or 8 of those things will be the same. So how do you advance a brand of leadership that helps get something done? And in a modern democracy, when you disagree, you have majority rules, and you enforce the will of the majority by protecting the rights of the minority. That has always informed my leadership style. It led me to where I am now, because when you do that, you bring into every single conversation, first of all, spirit of humility, understanding that we all suffer from some degree of experiential blindness. We don't know everything. If in fact you bring that humility into a room, we realize that, yeah, hopefully there's someone else in this room who's a subject matter expert on a certain situation, or someone, while they may not be a trained expert, has a valuable set of experiences that we can all lever up to our mutual benefit, then it makes you a better leader. The power of being able to say, I don't know, I've always found to be particularly powerful and helpful. It was very helpful, certainly my 12 years as mayor. As I left the mayor's office last month, the professional joy of my life, I often tell people my personal joy, obviously. I tell my wife she's the best thing that ever happened to me, and she agrees with me. She makes me better every day. Our girls are heart and soul, and the reason why we ran for office, why we as a family ran for office in the very first place, is because we wanted to work to build a city in the heart of the Deep South, where our girls would have the opportunity, the option, when they grew up, to have a chance to choose Columbia as their home. And then more importantly, to make sure that every other child, not as well situated, not as financially situated as our daughters, would also have the same opportunities to live up to their God-given potential. It was what animated us at the time. I knew that I had to learn a whole lot in order to be a very good and an effective mayor. But I also didn't know what I didn't know. Stepped into a situation here in Columbia where all across the country, indeed around the world, cities and metropolitan areas are growing rapidly. 85% of our population now lives in cities and metro areas. 89% of the jobs are here. 92% of America's GDP created in cities and metropolitan areas. We're watching this incredible growth emerging from the financial crisis of 08 and 09, and watching cities grow, but growing against the backdrop of an infrastructure that could not sustain that growth. And I don't mean that just in terms of bridges and roads and schools. I'm talking about infrastructure, social infrastructure that was not prepared for the disruption that it would bring to our lives, disruption of natural growth, as well as the technological disruption of automation and AI and advanced machine learning, and the effect that would have on people who live particularly in the two bottom quintiles of American economic society, being displaced from jobs. What does that mean when you have this growth, job displacement, property values shooting up, and infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, physical infrastructure, transportation, and logistic infrastructure that in many respects is relying on 19th century infrastructure with 20th century rules to govern that infrastructure, and 21st century technology now redefining that infrastructure. And oftentimes, those things that people and the issues that need the most attention and the most resources, the most data-driven solutions, are often the times that the issues that are most overlooked in our society. So leading in that era with limited resources, but trying to make sure that we're still delivering for our citizens was an amazingly challenging time, and I feel fortunate to have been forged in that period, and I hope we can discuss some of those experiences while we're together for this hour or so. I would say that the last 2 years in particular, I will touch on also the flood, the Hurricane Joaquin, the natural disasters, and the way in which weather-related climate events have changed the world in which we live, and the ability to build resilient infrastructure has fundamentally changed this country and the world in which we live. In October of 2015, we watched 12 trillion gallons of water fall on the Midlands of, both Carolinas, but drip down to the Midlands of South Carolina. Hundreds of dams broke, over 500 roads destroyed, our city infrastructure, water, sewer infrastructure damaged to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, 19 precious lives lost. The opportunity to bounce back from that, pulling everyone together in a comprehensive way, and our city employees really showing the world what we were made of, was an amazing opportunity and challenge. 2 years ago tomorrow, I found myself on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, listening to the late Congressman John Lewis speak to, I'm sure someone planned it, but it was incredibly impromptu, speak to all of us about this country, about this country's challenges. I remember 2 years ago this week is when many of us were really being first introduced to the pandemic. Wonderful pictures, and I'd be happy to try and share some of those maybe before we leave the call, of standing on the bridge and him exhorting to us to speak to our better angels. COVID-19 had not yet hit us. Actually, later that very week, we were together March 1st, March 6th. I had hosted the first Midlands Coronavirus Task Force meeting here. It's almost comical. You go back and look at the pictures, and there are about 60 of us in one room, sitting side by side with no masks on. We had no idea what we were coming up against over the next 2 years. But still on the bridge with Congressman Lewis and so many others, who have for the last several decades been carrying on the promise of this country finally living up to its true promise for all of her citizens. I'm thinking about as we exit Black History Month, and I'm not sure any of us could have anticipated what was happening to us at that moment. We had an opportunity, a challenge. I'm a mayor, so I would speak about the glass being half full. We had a challenge coming before us that I think none of us had ever expected. We had the pandemic, we had the economic disruption that I spoke about earlier that would pick up a pace, and some of the things that we thought would be happening in terms of technological advancement, displacing people from jobs we thought would happen 2031 came to 2021. We just a few months later, after the onset of the pandemic, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and for almost all of us, the vast majority of us, it was the very first time we saw a state-sponsored public execution, and it collectively broke America's hearts. So it was as related to being a public leader at the time, particularly mayors being on the front lines, engaging with citizens every single day. It was like someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, your house is on fire," and then someone says, "Hey, right in front of your house there's a sinkhole," and then they say, "Oh, coming down the street is a tornado." You had this amazing series of crises that were on top of all the things that you were dealing with at the center here, at the center of a $50 billion gross metropolitan product running a city, and you had to dig deep to figure out how could you turn all these moments into something meaningful, how you could turn these moments into a movement, how you could start to really bring people together at a time when we had to act together to defeat a pandemic, had to act together to defeat the pandemic of race or racism, systemic racism, but at the very same time, not being able to get around a table and discuss them like we normally would, or break bread, as many of our cultures, cultural traditions would teach us to do so. It did teach me, and I'm going to stop talking and hopefully start listening and maybe feel some questions. It did, the last 2 years in particular, taught me a lot of things. It taught me there's power in prayer. I knew that beforehand. I'm not sure that I've ever prayed as much as I did over the last 2 years for myself, for strength, for wisdom, for humility, for my family, for the community that I love. It did teach me that our decisions determine our destiny. I'm a big believer that the decisions we make now will affect us for posterity. It convinced me that we had to figure out some way to turn all this pain and passion into real progress, that we had to start thinking about real and meaningful ways that we can move our communities forward, this country forward, and I still believe that as goes America, so goes the world. It gave me, as someone who's not trained as a scientist, not trained as an epidemiologist, to have an even greater understanding and appreciation for data. When people, particularly in this hyper political world where we argue over social media and facts really aren't facts anymore, if you're speaking to reasonable people, it gave me a much stronger position to argue from a bully pulpit if I was able to use data to inform policy making in a meaningful way and communicate it to people who actually wanted answers and didn't just want to fight. It taught me the power of not just having data, but also humanizing that data and using it to try and enforce true systemic and structural change, the power of storytelling to pull people together and help advance an idea. If you're not communicating with them there, maybe you can catch them here and get things done. Understand that people don't really care what you know until they know that you care about them. I will tell you this, I am encouraged What I see, I'm speaking now mostly to all of us. I'm speaking mostly to the students that I teach at the Chan School. I've taught here at the University of South Carolina's Irish College for several semesters. I am very optimistic about what the world, where we'll be leaving the world, the hands that will be leaving the world. And young people, including my two teenagers, our two teenagers, are amazingly gifted and talented and smart and care about the world. It excites me about this next wave of leaders coming to fore. But I will tell you, the challenges before us are much more complex than they've ever been. I'm a big believer that complex problems require complex solutions, that these challenges that we've created for ourselves over the last hundreds of years won't be solved overnight, but we are at a point now where we can leverage what we know and what we've learned with technology at our back, so we can solve a lot of problems in ways that we never could have imagined before. We're going to dream big and act big to make it happen. I'm going to stop because I could probably talk all day. I'm happy to take some questions and engage maybe more sort of dialogue than monologue right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Benjamin. It looks like Dr. Swan has a few questions, and we welcome questions from the audience as well. Dr. Swan?
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Benjamin, for your presentation. And I heard in your presentation a lot of different ideas and passions that you have relative to your community. And some of the questions that, just to kind of get the ball rolling, you talk about models that, well, let's start off with just something around Black History Month. What are you saying to your daughters and to the youth within your community about their potential and the roles that they can play? And particularly, how do you motivate them, particularly Black males?
Sure. I remember it wasn't long after we were married. We'll celebrate 20 years marriage this year. I really started digging deeper into my experience as a young Black man growing up in South Jamaica, Queens, with my wife, my best friend, and she impressed upon me that I need to spend more time telling my story, because so often when you walk into a room, and each and every one of us has that experience with one person or another, I would walk into a room and these young men would probably in their minds think I was born in a suit. I'm not wearing my necktie right now, but I have it right here. They thought a mini Steve Benjamin was birthed, in a three-piece suit. And you have to really make sure they understand your experience. As I mentioned, I was suspended from high school twice. I had to go to night school to graduate. I had my own run-ins with law enforcement. And so often I know that my interactions with Officer DePinto are very different than the interactions that other Black men have had with law enforcement over the course of their career. I ran the state's second largest law enforcement agency in another life as a very young man, developed a deep and abiding respect for men and women who run towards danger when the rest of us running towards or running the other direction. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to understand that, we're all human, and work every single day to inculcate into the language that I use, into the things that I do, and how I say them, that spirit of humanity that seeks to understand that kind words heal. And if you do that, you can actually bring people together. So when I speak particularly to young Black men, I work very diligently to keep it real. But I also work very, very diligently to tap into these amazingly brilliant young men who have so much to offer the world, in a world that in many respects, and every community is different, is systemically stacked against them. So what I've tried to do is build a strong network from youth mentoring networks to internship opportunities. As mayor, we started a fellowship program. Over my time there, we had over 300 young people spend some time with us in the mayor's office, aggressively working to integrate them into opportunities that they never would have seen. Started a separate organization here we call the Talented 10th, that again is focused on elevating young people, particularly by connecting them with the amazing story of the African seed and the American sun in the American South, which so oftentimes goes untold. Rich, deep, strong, painful history, but it requires just a great degree of intentionality. And I will say this too: when it comes to my children, and when it comes to young Black men, I'm a girl dad. I've learned the power, and my students probably get tired of hearing me say this, but I've learned the power of when old folks tell you that God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk. And so often, young people are used to people talking to them and telling them what they need and telling them what they should do. And sometimes we just need to shut up and we need to listen. And if you can connect with a young person, and then sometimes you're actually helping them, you might be helping them make a mistake. You might be helping them go down a path, not a bad path, but maybe the wrong path, but also learn a lesson. And we all know that the most valuable teacher you'll ever have is experience. Experience, however, is a painful teacher. So if you can teach young people in a way to trust you so that they will value your experiences, and so the next time they're able to leverage your experiences to maybe skip over that pothole or that bump in the road, then it's amazing that you've built something special there. So I'd say this too with my girls. I've learned this with my daughters. Obviously, we're all learning from each other every single day. Sometimes I just shut my mouth and I listen to them. I hear them out. I'll challenge them. I'll teach them to defend their positions. My youngest is my future. She will argue me up one hill and down the other hill. And my job has been to challenge her every step of the way until she's gonna make her argument stronger. She does that. And if she loses an argument, she'll go and research and she'll come back and she'll take you on again. But she's learning something every step of the way, but she also knows her dad's listening to her. I'll tell you, I'm impressed.
Gunware? Okay, Carl.
Any other questions?
Jane, you want to take the next one, or you want me to add another one here? Because I got a good one for him.
You go ahead, and then we'll go over to Dr. Donoff's question.
All right. I was just going to ask you, you talked about your task force and regarding the models and the containment, the treatment, and prevention for the spread of COVID-19. I wanted to know, within your task force, whether at the beginning or at some point, oral health providers were there a part of your task force team, or dentists, if you want to call them that.
Yes, there were some dentists. I'm not sure, we weren't necessarily thinking about them. They were there more so as community leaders, Doc, who understood science and not necessarily in their roles as dentists. And I'm a big believer, and I tell my classes regularly that regardless of where you started in life, I know that we all come from very different backgrounds, and some of us have taken much longer journeys than others. The reality is that every single young person, not so young person, on this call is in an amazing position of privilege and power right now. We enjoy a relatively comfortable space that just de facto makes us leaders right now. So I really impress upon all of us. You don't want to be all things to all people in every community in which you operate, but there is a responsibility to step up and lead, particularly in times of crises. Every oral health provider, every dentist, every nurse, every orthodontist, you bring a very specific skill set to the table that can help your community and help folks. I remember early in my career, we worked on a community health project down in the Allendale. If you have a second, someone put a note up about Governor Edwards. This is where Governor McNair's family, his wife's family, was, but one of the poorest parts of our state, in which they had some incredible number. I mean, it was maybe 90+% of fifth and sixth graders who'd never been to a dentist, who'd never seen a dentist, and the number of children who I'm convinced could not focus on reading, writing, and arithmetic because of significant oral health issues. There was an effort that focused on like a laser beam on trying to address that in that very specific community. What we did learn mostly in our task force, as we dealt with in the early days of COVID in particular, is that there's no one way to solve a problem. And as we got people around the table, either the physical table or the virtual table, that when you attack something from an intergovernmental, intersectoral approach, putting so many different types of strengths around the table, looking at public, private, and philanthropic partnerships to actually solve a problem, you break it down in a way in which we have very clear goals and measurable and achievable and results oriented, clear who has what responsibility. It's amazing what you can get done. It was a bit more difficult, obviously, the early days of the pandemic, just realizing the political culture that we were operating in, and the federal government not necessarily working the way that many of us thought it should, made it that much more difficult. But I will tell everyone on this call again, we're all in amazing positions of privilege and power relative to the vast majority of men and women in this country and across the globe. We need to make sure we step into our space as leaders and help solve problems, whether they're directly in our wheelhouse or even tangentially related.
Agree wholeheartedly. We have, excuse me, a question.
I see a question from Bruce Dunoff.
That's what I was going to mention. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I knew Governor Edwards too. He was a gentleman. There are some great pre-professional programs. I'm not sure about dental school, but the med school here at the university, there are. I want to say, I'm not sure if the school where he was president, but not particularly not only recruiting, but also placing underrepresented minorities, particularly African American physicians, in some of the most challenging areas of our state. Some of the census tracts that certainly with South Carolina's refusal to expand Medicaid over the last several years, we've watched rural hospital after rural hospital close. The university has done a really good job of not only recruiting, but also placing, and actually hope to help them resource an effort that will help them expand those efforts significantly. So there are some, and I'd be happy to identify some of them and share this one specific program that they're trying to raise some more money for to scale up that effort. And that's a really good example. So many of the solutions that we seek are up and running in so many different communities all across the country. It's just identifying some of these really best practices and great programs, scaling them up in some places and replicating them in other places. We can solve problems. We can. It just takes the will and intentional fortitude, again, against a really interesting backdrop of noise that I never thought we'd see as we worked our way through this pandemic. It's made things kind of scary at times, to be honest with you. I remember a time when I was young, and many of the folks on this call were young, where there are certain things I'd never say. I still wouldn't say because I was afraid of embarrassing my mother or my father, where you actually had to own your words. And now, because of social media, people have anonymity and reach, and people will almost say anything. You don't have to be held accountable for it. And now we've added into various aspects of social media, not only anonymity and reach, but also the ability to monetize that nonsense. So you had the power of capital, the power of Adam Smith Wealth of Nations to the equation. And it makes for a really dangerous and powerful cocktail. So it makes our collective work, that much more difficult and important.
I would like to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. You mentioned an example of a community health center that was experiencing some access issues, shortages perhaps of oral health professionals, and some work you did with community stakeholders to try and address those challenges once they were recognized. And you've talked a lot about building stakeholders. I sense that a lot of, and you mentioned that many issues that happen at the community level locally are also national. And I'm just wondering, with your work with the Conference of Mayors, are there any accomplishments that you're particularly proud of from your time as mayor that you have taken to the national stage that have opportunities for helping address these issues nationally?
Sure. You're probably gonna make me geek out a little bit, but it's okay. I'm a numbers guy. Before I was mayor, I served as the public finance counsel for the city. I was bond counsel, infrastructure. We help the city finance things, and my role, I speak every 2 years, and did this past December at the Harvard New Mayors Institute, was really focusing on helping our public sector leaders understand the role of fiduciary and public trust and being a good steward of resources. And if in fact you understand how your entities are paid for, who funds them, then if you're able to tweak a few things here and adjust a few things there, then it unleashes capital for the things that really help drive prosperous communities by investing in your people. So I'm a numbers guy. The two things, when I served as president of the Conference of Mayors, I established 2 centers at the Conference of Mayors. These are both pre-pandemic. I left the presidency before the pandemic. The first one focused on smart cities, on the realities that so often when we talk about smart cities, yes, we talk about broadband, which is obviously, thank God, probably the greatest byproduct of the pandemic is now it's universally accepted that broadband is indeed infrastructure, and realizing that without broadband access in every community, it is the new infrastructure of the 21st century. You all have to have it, but also helping people realize that if you're going to have a truly smart city, that addressing the real problems plaguing your city on transportation access, on ameliorating food insecurity issues, on successful ways to leverage technology to address issues of housing and homelessness in effective ways. So I established the Mayor's Leadership Institute of Smart Cities based at NYU in partnership with the Conference of Mayors. More importantly, or as importantly, I should say, I also established the Mayor's Institute on Compassion, Inclusive Cities. It started my tenure, the very first week of my tenure, first month of my tenure as president of the Conference of Mayors. Took a bipartisan group of mayors to the border in Tornillo, Texas, to protest the treatment of migrant children at the U.S. Border. Over the course of that year, we then took a larger group of mayors to Montgomery, Alabama. Some of you may have had a chance to visit museum founded by Brian Stevenson and the Legacy Museum to understand the history of this country and the way in which human chattel slavery and the slave trade and now the prison industrial complex, how it shaped the dialogue and policymaking in America to this day. And from Tornillo through Montgomery, Alabama, we then went to Auschwitz and Birkenau to understand the great tragedy of the Shoah and the Holocaust. Again, a very intentional journey over the course of my tenure as president of the conference to begin to just inculcate into every single mayor who many may not be directly touched by the challenges of migration or immigration. Some are completely distant from this country's history and its birth and the slave trade. And me, obviously, maybe a lot of younger people, not so young people, believe the Holocaust was hundreds of years ago and not there's still survivors to this day, trying to understand that if in fact we're going to be strong, prosperous, thriving communities, we have to first focus on building truly inclusive, compassionate cities. But those are my two legacies, and probably the two things I stress to, in addition to understanding financial security and fiscal responsibility, or the areas I focus on most as president of the conference.
Mayor Benjamin, also, I would like to ask you, in terms of issues and race being on applications for college. Harvard was sued by a group of students a few years back who felt that race should not be an issue when we're taking students into consideration for entrance into our colleges and universities. That was defeated in federal court. Now the Harvard University, as well as the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, are being called to the Supreme Court of the United States for discussions and arguments about whether or not race should be on the application, and it should be a consideration for, as other things, like grades and test scores, hobbies and activities, and whether race should also be a part of the score in terms of admittance to colleges and universities. I assume for the reason of diversity and inclusion and equity. Your opinion on that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, okay? a lot to unpack there. I would say, in the limited amount of time we have left, that this country, and I'm always they are significant. We see them manifested so often on police body cams or on citizens who capture abuses of power on their cell phones and share them with us every single day. I'm always careful to recognize the fact that that while we aren't where we want to be, we're not where we used to be. And we have to have the intellectual honesty to recognize the country has come a long way, but we're not where we want to be. And I believe that if in fact we are going to become this country that truly values inclusion and understands, and I've been so fortunate over every course of my leadership career to surround myself with people who have a diversity of opinions, have a diversity of experiences, diverse backgrounds. It's allowed me to make much better decisions, to be surrounded by a diverse coterie of talented men and women. Organizations, and we've seen study after study that actually are led by diverse teams outperform those that are not. It should be in our collective best interest to ensure that each and every one of us has a chance to live up to his or her God-given potential. How each institution does that, I can't speak to exactly how it happens, but I do know from personal experience the value of working aggressively to ensure that you have a diverse team at the table, a diverse student body at the university. And if it's important to Harvard or Chapel Hill or any of the other institutions of higher learning, then you got to be willing to fight that fight. I was talking to a former colleague last night, and it's a movie quote, so I won't even pretend that it's mine. But we were trying to determine whether or not it should press forward on a particular issue that was deep in that's a piece that can only be found on the other side of war. And if that battle comes, you have to be willing to fight it. But sometimes you just gotta fight the fight. Sometimes you gotta fight the fight. Sometimes you lose, sometimes you win. If you win, we're all better for it. Sometimes even if you lose, we're better for it. So hopefully the powers that be at those two institutions and all others think it's important enough to wage the fight, even sometimes if the outcome might seem clear. It's important, and it's important not just to. It's important oftentimes to the body politic, to the spirit of an institution, when those who align themselves with you see that you're willing to fight the fight on behalf of decency or justice or equality or inclusion.
Thank you. Jane, do you have time for one other question before we finish, and you can close out? And also I would say, Mayor Benjamin, that Harvard University was founded by John Harvard, who was not an instructor, but who put up a lot of the resources to start Harvard University. And his principle at that time was that Harvard would be the first college in America. And its aim was to train the recent immigrants from Europe, but also the indigenous tribal people that were in the area.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Jane?
The first,
mm-hmm.
and just so you also know, the first African-American graduate of Harvard College was Richard T. Greener, who also was the very first African-American faculty member at the University of South Carolina. His office sits about 5 blocks south of where I'm sitting right now. A historic figure connecting Harvard and the University of South Carolina.
That's fantastic. We thank you for sharing that. We know a lot about many of our first graduates at the School of Dental Medicine, but I don't think we knew that one and that particular connection. So thank you. One of our participants has asked about how we can get additional information on the USC programs that you spoke of.
Just tell me who to send it to, and I can make sure it gets there probably as soon as today. So Salif on my team who helped set this up, I'll send it to Salif, and he'll make sure however you can distribute it would be great.
Okay, great. We'll make the connection through Christina Casano, who is our program, our department administrator. She can make that connection. Thank
Super.
you. So this has been a fascinating discussion. You know, some of our work here at the School of Dental Medicine is also focused on building coalitions, trying to help, as we said at the outset, create access not only to healthcare services, but social determinants like water, food, housing, security. And I really loved hearing about your coalition building and your pragmatic leadership style, because I think there's a lot for us, our students in particular, to think about as they shape their own careers and think about in their roles as clinicians and providers, how can they work with other community constituents to make sure that their patients have everything that they need. And so I think this has been a wonderful and inspiring conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and keep up the great work. We got to dream big dreams, and we got to act on them. Okay. God bless you.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Take care. Appreciate your
Thank
time
you.
today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.